Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen W. Long. This is The Writing Life, and really kind of a special guest today. We've been waiting a long time to get Karen Huntsberger back on. In fact, how many years?
3
years?
4, almost 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we do that and jump into, because we got a lot of questions for you, I want to just let folks know Kim Stafford is going to be on the show here shortly, and he had such a response to an announcement that he was going to show up in town that the venue had to be changed to the Carnegie Room at McMinnville Public Library. So that's going to be April 4th, which is a Thursday, and I guess you get to see it there. And just really happy to have him in town and then have him on the show. So Karen, welcome.
Thank you.
And you know I loved your first book. I have told you many times about that. You've now come out with, it's not a sequel, but it's a similar kind of a book. And this one's called I'll Be Seeing You. And I'm going to stop talking and let you tell us what it's about.
Well, I'll Be Seeing You is about my aunt who joined the Navy WAVES, which stands for Women Activated for Voluntary Emergency Service. Mm-hmm. It was the Navy Reserve in World War II.
Okay.
And the creation of the women's services in World War II was a huge deal. Lots of wrangling in Congress for months and months and months because of the changing roles of women, that women were assigned certain acceptable professions, mostly stay at home.
Right.
And to have women serve in the military was a huge, huge deal. And they needed the women desperately, and they were to replace men who were going off to be in the infantry and thing. You can imagine men were not terribly amused about this either. Because,
really?
Yeah, well, part of it is like if they had some nice, safe job in the U.S. working in the military.
Oh, I see.
And then
okay.
they got transported to the infantry. There was a lot of resentment about that. In general, there was a lot of resentment about women serving in the services.
I guess I didn't know that part.
Well, and that's part of what I learned. I spent 2 years researching this,
right.
and I learned a lot, including reading a lot of the congressional record about all the wrangling that went on about what people would say that women should be doing, and how could they change roles like this. Mm-hmm. And then finally, they were so desperate they had to do it because women were desperately needed, not only in the services, but also in communities to replace men who had gone off to war. And even WAVES, like Lucy, even WAVES picked corn in the Midwest as one of their jobs. And a lot of women went and did farm work, too, that weren't in the military reserves, women's reserves.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that. I knew in the public sector, Rosie the Riveter.
Right.
But I never thought of that, any pushback in the military.
Huge pushback. And the first group that was created was the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which later became WAC, the WACs.
Okay.
And there was actually a slander campaign when they first started, and they were suggesting that women who had joined the WACs were just in it to go overseas and just be loose women, basically.
Right.
And it was a couple of newspapers that created this slander campaign. And just like Facebook today,
one
little thing gets out there and then it gets taken up everywhere.
Right.
And so the fact was it wasn't true. Women who joined the services did this out of a lot of reasons. Patriotism.
Sure.
Wanting to serve while their husband or boyfriend was serving. They might have come from a military family to begin with. And a lot of women did it as a way out of the drudgery of, say, being a Rosie the Riveter, of doing factory work.
Right.
And also, it was a way to see the world.
Well, I was going to say, nobody would hold it against a man if he joined the Army and said, part of my reasoning is I've never been to France.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So, no, I didn't realize that, though.
But the women also weren't allowed to serve overseas until Red Cross women were, but that was a different organization than the military. But women, finally, WAVES were allowed to go to Hawaii, and nurses, of course, served overseas, various divisions of nurses. But in general, most WAVES, like Lucy, worked here in the United States at various jobs, all kinds of things, including parachute riggers, and they trained in flight simulators. They did lots of clerical things.
Really? Okay.
Lucy was in map making. She was an artist, so she did this highly detailed, kill your eyes sort of work.
And that came from photographs? Is that How did they know what to draw?
Well, my understanding of how the Hydrographic Office worked, and it still exists, is that it was reports from ships that were in the Pacific, particularly in Pacific, that they were mapping out atolls and sandbars and all kinds of things where buoys were, and trying to protect the troops in that way that were over in the South Pacific, and trying to update every possible chart they had.
Sure.
So that it was accurate.
Something that I just thought of, I've read the book and love that as well, but as you were saying, what WAVE stands for, volunteer, they were paid?
They were paid, and the interesting thing about it was that they were paid as much as a man.
Oh, good.
Just to start, obviously there were women officers who were paid more, but when Lucy entered the WAVE, she started as a seaman, S-E-A-M-E-N, and first class, and then they were various ranks they could raise to, but they advertised very clearly about same pay as a man, and that was revolutionary too.
Right.
And
I wonder if that wasn't part of the prejudice. We're men and we ought to be getting more because we are men.
I'm sure it was on some level.
Yeah.
And, but also the acronyms, Voluntary Emergency Service.
Right.
It was made very clear all along that it wasn't going to continue after the war. And
temporary.
It was temporary.
Yeah.
So when they signed up, they had to serve for the length of the war plus 6 months. And, part of me thinks, man, that could have been 20 years, you know. And because they were voluntary, of course, they could quit at any time. They weren't drafted like men were drafted. But most women really enjoyed it. And I have a friend who did a documentary about the WAVEs. Her mother was a WAVE, and she interviewed a lot of WAVEs that were still living about 10 years ago.
Oh, boy.
And these women said it was the time of their life, that they got to travel and be in other cities and experience things they wouldn't have otherwise.
Just to back up kind of a human nature thing, all of that's true, and they're that age. Aren't we more adventurous at that age?
Right.
And things are new.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and plus there was an age restriction on
Okay.
can be a WAVE. You had to be between 20 and 36. If you were older than 36, they didn't want you, which seems somewhat sexist to me too.
Sure.
Unless you had some tremendous skill, like you were a doctor, you had a scientist, some kind of, already degreed profession.
So was there not an equivalent restriction for men? An
And
age
the
restriction? Yeah.
Well, the draft kept changing as they needed more men. And Lucy does talk about it in her letters home about they're now going to be taking 18-year-olds. And she was worried because her youngest brother was still in high school.
Okay.
In fact, he got drafted 1 week out of high school. He was
Oh,
he
my
was
goodness.
off.
Yeah.
He was off to the Navy. He got drafted and he decided to choose the Navy instead of going off to the infantry. So
You talked about letters, and I don't think we've done this on camera, but I've certainly talked to you about how things are different now with instant communication, email and so on. But Lucy's letters particularly, even when I was reading the book, I thought, I don't know that you did any editing, but they're artful, they're concise, but they're informative. It's a narrative of what's going on in her life. And I think we've lost that, or we're losing it.
well, I think so. I think sometimes that my legacy of letter writing will be through email, but the letters of this time, that was their form of communication.
Sure.
They could call on the telephone, but it was extremely expensive. She mentions it a few times, and she says, I
But
had to
that's
call.
not even that far. I mean, that was continental United States.
Yeah, it wasn't even.
Right.
It was from the Midwest to Washington, D.C., where she was
Right.
stationed, and she says, I hated to call and spend the money, but I really needed to hear your voice,
Sure.
Mother and Dad.
Sure.
But the letter writing, Lucy was an artist, so she's extremely descriptive to begin with. So we get more color from her writing than, say, my first book, where my father was just more matter of fact, although he did describe a lot of things. But her letter writing, I did do some editing, but mostly left out boring things, right?
Okay.
But she always says she doesn't write home very often, but the fact is she regularly wrote home at least every 2 weeks.
Right.
And that was the form of communication. And now we're losing that ability. I had a person say to me recently, are the letters really that long? Did they really write that?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I have trouble
Yeah.
stringing 3 sentences together, this person said
Right.
to me, but that was...
Well, 3 sentences and an emoji.
Yeah.
Yeah. Put it, yeah.
Right, and so texting, Twitter, the short snippets
Right.
are so different than what was happening in World War II. And everybody did it. And the mail was a huge concern
Right.
for soldiers in Europe and the South Pacific.
I recently made a reconnection with a high school friend, and so this has been, we're going on 50 years. And how did this work? I sent something to her in the mail, and she wrote a letter back. And then on the back of the letter, there's a little advertisement for "Let's support the post office," which I thought was, and she could have emailed, but she didn't. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the arguments is it's just fun to get things in the mail.
I agree.
Yeah.
I've been to the post office the last few days, and I think about how important in smaller communities post offices are, and libraries. They're just the heart of the community.
You bet.
And at this time in 1945, 1942, 43, 45, 44, they got mail twice a day.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, so I went down and got the evening mail, and was so glad to find your letter.
Yeah.
And we can't even think of that now.
Yeah.
It's just so. But yes, I believe in supporting the post office too.
So, to jump kind of to the first book, I mean, it applies to Lucy as well. But one of the things that struck me is the time lag. So particularly with your dad's letters, they might comment, his parents might comment, we haven't heard from you in fill in the blank.
Right.
And sometimes it was a long time.
Right.
And we worry, what's going on? Is somebody injured or lost or what? Now, even in the military, 2 things. One is when the fellows are in theater, they could come home or they could come back to the base and communicate.
Right.
I know that just as an example, at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, they're actually prosecuting the war. They are controlling drones, let's say in Afghanistan, and then they go home to eat. Mm-hmm. They go home at night and see their kids.
Right.
And I wonder psychologically I think there's probably a benefit and detriment to both things. How do you process being at war 9 to 5 and go home?
Well, I often think about why do we have war at all? I was driving yesterday and I thought, what kind of civilized country would send their children off to fight with each other? And that's been part of my whole purpose with these books, is to not let people forget history. And history is extremely intimate when it's in people's letters. Yeah. It's the minute by minute, this is what I did today. And so, yes, I think the psychological damage is always great from war of any sort.
However you do it.
However you do it. And absolutely.
And for your father, it was life-changing.
It was absolutely life-changing for my father. I think it was life-changing for Lucy. I've given a lot of book talks on the first book, and a lot of people come up and tell me their World War II story. And because, as I've talked to you about before, everybody has one.
Right.
Everyone who's alive pretty much knows somebody in their family that was in the war because of the 63 countries that were involved, which just, to me, seems like mass hysteria, of course. But
and
everybody
that is
has
a world
story.
War.
That's a world war. And I also think that the trauma, there's always this talk about how trauma trickles down through the family or trickles down through your DNA. And I've always questioned that, but I do think it trickles down in how people live their lives. And for my father, it was life-changing, and it made him a pacifist, but it also made him...
Changed his career.
Yeah, changed everything and changed who he was as a person. And war has that impact on everyone, I really feel. Whether you were a soldier or a person, just in the vicinity, your life changed for nothing that you caused,
Right. We have no answers for that. And
not today.
Certainly in the next 20 minutes or so.
Right.
But boy, am I with you. And actually, while you were talking, I was thinking, okay, look at the advancements we've made with each other in terms of gender roles and so on. Wouldn't it be great if one of the changes coming up here is let's not do war anymore?
Yes, let's not.
Yeah.
My father was preaching that all these years, and I think that as humans, we have the ability to make that change and not just thinking war is inevitable.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that seems to be, or it has been the default.
The default,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you get older and you look back on your life and you see all the times that it's happened in one's own lifetime,
Sure.
and why is it still occurring? And
Yeah.
we know lots of the reasons for that, but it is, World War II, people always say, well, that was different. Well, yes and no.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
The motivation might have been different. I don't know that the individual toll was different. I think about my own dad, and I think that generation didn't talk about it, but I think I see or saw in his reaction to things, even as an older guy, loud noises,
right,
things like that.
right,
My mom said when they were first married, they would be in bed and she would wake up realizing that he had gotten dressed and under the bed and he wasn't awake yet.
right,
Yeah.
right, that fear. I've heard that from a lot of people who are never comfortable in a crowd.
Right.
And can't go to, a big event or Disneyland even.
Sure.
And that stays with you. And those images stay in one's mind in one way or another, I'm sure, and it's how people learn to cope with them.
Oh, I was going to say they're not conscious.
Right.
It's just it's a survival reaction.
And I have found in the years I've been working on World War II research is that veterans that are still living, when they get in their 90s, they will start to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think, sometimes I remember growing up thinking about guys telling their war stories, and as a kid you think, oh gee, how boring.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's really not, and they're trying to process it, I think is why they're telling. They want you to know. They want you to know that that happened to them, and it was horrible, and it was traumatic, and they survived it.
Right.
And it meant something.
I have a brother who was young enough that he was too young for Vietnam, and missed all that. I think, thank goodness. But he has said he sort of regrets not having the opportunity. And I think what he sees is things on a big scale. There's a lot of money involved, which means equipment. Boy, you have, a ship or an airplane or something. And I think that's like a fire truck, for a boy. Oh boy, this is going to be great. And then I mentioned that to an older friend who was in the war, and he said there is nothing in a war that makes it okay,
Right.
that makes it a good enough experience that you want to be in it. He said nobody wants to be in it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me the most about reading the congressional record when I was researching women's services was a senator that said, who will stay home and cook and clean and have the children so that in 20 years they too may march off to war.
Oh boy.
And it's like, wow, it's like,
you got to go.
it's like
What a knucklehead.
so it's just like, no, we're not doing this every generation or every
Right.
other generation. And
Yeah.
so that really struck me.
Well, let's talk about something more fun.
Okay.
More positive. The changing women's roles. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe World War II maybe could have been like the kickoff, do you think, for
I do.
reevaluating?
Right. And one of the things that I learned in this process was I kept, all my life I kept thinking, why didn't women's lib happen immediately after World War II?
Sure.
I wondered that, but then I realized when you have names like WAVES, Women Activated for Voluntary Emergency Service, and all the propaganda, and we think only the enemy uses propaganda. We use propaganda heavily to recruit men and women for World War II. And it was everywhere. It was at eye level in every building, every window, even bathrooms had these posters in them. And I think it was made clear all along, and the Office of War Information did this intentionally, is like they need these women to know it's temporary. When the men come home, they get their jobs back. And part of it was they were wanting to not have huge unemployment with all these guys coming back home.
Right.
However, but then you had the problem of women being unemployed, and women that were single breadwinners,
Right.
or single moms because their husband had been killed in the war.
Right.
And so these women who were depending on that, suddenly they're out of a job. So I do think that this women's services was the start of the women's movement.
You can't
but it
put
was
that
subtle.
back in the box.
No,
Once it's out, yeah.
yeah. And once these women had this freedom, and some of them did not leave the service, they finally made women serving in the military in 1948, which doesn't seem that long after then it became a permanent thing. And if you look on the Navy website today, they very specifically are recruiting women, and they are doing it saying, there's a job for you, whatever it is. It's like, and it's a challenge, and it's very positive and uplifting. It's not like they're saying, we have these jobs for women and we have these jobs for men. There is very clear that anything can be for them.
Yeah.
So those role models, whether you are an active supporter of the military or not, are important for equity of men and women. But yeah, I think the women's movement very definitely started. And then the other part of propaganda that happened after World War II, we had all these images in Life magazine and Look magazine about the housewife that was so happy with her, her new appliances and freezers and all these things that came out to make life easier, like dishwashers. And the image was projected of women being happy in these roles when they might have, been sitting there drinking all day, who knows, because they had lost their meaningful contribution in a job.
Yeah.
And so I think as it, the years trickled on, the women's movement then became just a part of it's suffrage, how long that took for women to get the vote, and of course equal pay does not exist now.
No. But I was going to say, when any of us evaluate something and say it's a long time, that's a relative term.
Right.
And I think, what do we have to relate it to? What's our measuring stick? Well, it's probably our life. And so that's obviously what we know. But if you can back away from that and look at sort of the history of something, the history of the world, the history of civilization, the United States, whatever it is, maybe it's not so long. Maybe we really are making progress.
I do think we are making progress. It seems in one's own lifetime so incremental as to not be worthy in some ways, but we continue progress. Keep passing the open windows and move on, and I think these people that came back from World War II, whether they were men or women, they so wanted the war to be over worldwide. Everybody was so jubilant, and when it was over, the celebrations in the streets. And Lucy talks about this in her letters home about, she was stationed in Washington, D.C., and she talks about the mobs of people and just, happy, jubilant. And I think, so many people didn't talk about the war because they were so desperate for it to be over and have normal. And they wanted a happy life. And they came home, and we had what in you and my lifetime seems like the idyllic 50s and 60s that people look back on as, oh, things were great there. Well, not necessarily,
It depends on who you were.
Who you were, yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in fact, I've had this conversation with another local person, and what I took as normal, because I didn't know anything else, in fact, was abnormal. And again, depending on who you were, you could get a job.
Right.
Mom could stay home, that kind of stuff, if she wanted to.
Right.
Now there's a flip side to that. Maybe she didn't want to.
Right.
And maybe there weren't as many openings. But yeah, for me it was fun.
Well, and my mom was home too until I was in high school, and I just thought that was normal.
Right.
And was she unhappy? Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Just to expand on that, normal is one characteristic or way to characterize it, almost mandatory. Because, as you say, what if you didn't want to do that?
Right.
Where do you go?
Yeah. What are the possibilities, the opportunities?
Yeah.
And also, depending on where you live, whether it's a big city or
Sure.
a small place. And
Right.
so I think Lucy, having been trained in New York City, which is so exciting after growing up in a little tiny town,
Right.
and then living in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C.
What she got to see.
What she got to see and what she got to do, and the soldiers and sailors who came. I laugh when I say this, but it was almost like it was obligatory to date any soldier that asked you out.
Yeah.
Because she's
It
always
was a
talking
patriotic
about
duty.
It was a patriotic
Yeah.
duty to go out with these guys, and
Yeah.
she talks about various people but the relationships were transitory because these guys were going to go away.
Sure.
They were going to be shipped out. They were sent home. They were on a boat, whatever. And so she ended up at the end of the war with none of these guys, whoever they were.
Well, but she was still a young person.
She was still young,
Yeah.
yes. But then to come back to a small rural town after having that experience, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That must have been really hard, after she slept for a couple of weeks and it's like, okay, I can relax and I
Right.
don't have to do this intense job. But
Right.
these waves were proud of what they did, absolutely proud.
Well, I certainly picked that up. Go back to the dating just a little bit, because
Sure.
I remember reading that, and I thought that really is different than now. In fact, when I was of dating age, you could go out on a date, and then at some point maybe you went steady. That was something. My granddaughter, when I watched her behavior, or that generation, that age group, they never, it was at least my observation, they never went out with one person unless that was it.
Right.
They never went on a date. And Lucy went on many dates.
Right.
And I think it was a different thing. It was, I would like to see Gene Kelly. Would you like to see Gene Kelly? Let's go together.
Right.
And then that was fine.
Right.
It didn't mean something other than that.
Just entertainment and
Right.
and for the soldiers to
Companionship.
escape from
Sure.
the drudgery. And I think there's so many World War II movies of, the guys going off and the woman kissing them at the train station and
Right.
and this whole aspect of just the camaraderie of people weren't dating in the same way. It just was transitory, and they had fun. And they, in Washington D.C., they talk about, going to see Washington's home. They go to the zoo.
Right,
They often. The other thing was that was a way to go out to eat. So it's like
Sure.
they ran. Oh, we met these two sailors, and they took us out to
Right.
dinner. Okay, great.
Right.
And so those kinds of relationships, yes, were
Yeah.
very different then.
Okay. Karen, let's do something real quick because we're going to run out of time.
Sure.
I know that you've talked about books give you a way to be in someone else's shoes.
Right.
Talk about that just for a minute. And I think we kind of have been. But
Well, we have been, and I think that with both of these books, I had to, part of it, them being family members, it was
right.
really amazing for me, of course, to learn what my father had been through that I didn't
Sure.
know. But also, Lucy, when you you read somebody's letters or journal, you feel that it's maybe voyeuristic in a way, but it's also, they left them. They left them here for
Yeah,
a reason. They
right.
left them for somebody to find them. And I think it gives such a way to be transported to somebody else's life,
Right.
to see through their eyes.
Yeah.
And it's the ultimate history. I mean, we have history books, but this is personal history. And I think lots of people have these
What
letters.
is
They
that
don't know what.
prime source, or what is that called?
Yeah,
Or
primary source.
Primary source.
They're absolute
Yeah.
primary sources.
Yeah.
And so any book can transport you
Yeah.
to in somebody else's life, and I think you learn from it. You learn something that you didn't know, and
Sure.
and that's to me the beauty of books. And
Yeah.
when I had this funny experience when I was working on this book of working with the Franklin Roosevelt Library, because Lucy and her 50 Waves got to go to the White House for tea.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And it was kind of a lottery who was picked, and she
Yeah.
got to go.
Yeah.
And I thought, surely there's photos of this. And I called, I talked to the National Archives. They didn't have any. So they said, do the FDR library. So I contacted them. And I learned at that point there was no official White House photographer until Kennedy,
Oh, my gosh.
which I had no idea. But they did find in their vertical files, they did find the list of waves and the thank you note from Mrs. Roosevelt. There are no photos, but
Oh.
Lucy's words are so descriptive, you can almost see what it was like.
Right.
But when I was transported, I was so involved in being in the 1940s all the time. When this librarian called me back, it said FDR president. And I thought, hey, great idea.
Yeah.
And then I picked up the phone and realized it was, 2016, and it wasn't, because in my mind I was in like 1945.
And was your hair in a bun then? Or?
No, but it was.
But it was fun.
It was very funny for me because
Yeah.
when you're reading or writing, I do think you need to be transported into that person's life so you can feel what they felt and live what they lived.
I write fiction, but I have said when I'm writing well, and I think it's the same with you, it's like a daydream or a play or you're a movie. You're in this thing, and you can see it.
Right.
You can see it and smell it, and you're right there.
Right. And I love that part of it. I loved the research part of it. I obviously have learned things I wish I never knew about World War II, but that's all part of the experience, and I can't negate the parts of it that made me feel awful. But I learned a lot.
Yeah.
A lot more to learn.
Okay. Karen, thank you so much. We're out of
Thank
time.
you.
But folks, I just can't recommend these two books highly enough. They're just delightful, as is Karen. And so visit me at my website, stephenwlong.com. Karen, your website?
Waitingforpeace.com.
Yeah, go see them both. And I suspect they can contact you through that?
Yes.
Yeah, and contact me through mine. So thank you. We'll see you next time. Kim Stafford coming up. That's going to be fun. And I'll just see you on the Writing Life. Take care. Bye-bye.
What do you think? We done?
I don't know, you guys wanna do one just with yourself without me doing the
They think we're
markers?
done, if
No,
they got
no.
enough, they got enough.
They got enough? Probably, okay, sounds good.
Let's go lunch.
Oh.
I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could use a bite too.